Okay, I think we'll give it a few more seconds here. Hi, everyone. And on behalf of the Julio Fine Arts Gallery at Loyola University, Maryland, I would like to welcome you all to our program this evening, 2020 Visions, Public Art in a Year of Protests and Pandemics. I am Megan Rook-Koepsel, the director of the Julio Fine Arts Gallery, and I am so very pleased to be joined tonight by my colleague and co-moderator for this evening's conversation, Assistant Professor of Studio Arts, Billy Friebele, and by our guest speaker, Karyn Miller, who I will be properly introducing in just a minute, for what I think will be an engaging discussion around public art as it relates to what has happened over the last 8 months. And some of you may have attended our panel, Whose Art Is It Anyway? Public Art and Collective Memory last February, just before the pandemic hit. And we are excited to extend that incredible conversation with a little bit more insight into what's happened since then with tonight's speaker. Before we dive in, just a couple of housekeeping notes. Please connect with the Julio Fine Arts Gallery on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. We are at Julio Art Gallery and all those platforms to keep up with our upcoming program announcements and all that we are doing to keep our community connected to the arts. You can also find out more about the gallery on our website, julioartgallery.com, or email us at julioartgallery@loyola.edu. We welcome your thoughts and feedback. The gallery is supported in part by Maryland State Arts Council. To discover more about the Maryland State Arts Council and how they impact Maryland, visit msac.org. While we cannot see your faces or hear your voices, we nonetheless encourage you to submit your questions through the program, throughout the program, through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we will do our best to get to all the questions. Please feel free to ask a question at any point during tonight's conversation. We are doing it more conversationally so that we have an opportunity to incorporate your questions as they come up. Tonight's guest speaker, Karyn Miller, is a dear friend and talented curator and arts professional whose work I admire greatly. As the Golden Triangle Business Improvement District's BID, Public Space Activation Curator, Karyn Miller devises and implements a year-round public art program for DC's Central Business District. At the Golden Triangle, Karyn has led 2 large-scale public art partnerships with the Smithsonian Institution, temporary and permanent public art projects, and related public programs. Karyn previously served as Arlington Art Center's curator and director of exhibitions, conceiving and delivering a year-round exhibition schedule and public programs for 3 distinct exhibition programs. Prior to that, Karyn spent more than a decade building relationships with the region's emerging and mid-career artists. She served as gallery director for 5 years at Connor Contemporary before moving to Cultural DC's Flashpoint Gallery, where she devoted more than 6 years to collaborating with artists and leading their visual arts program. Karyn led several offsite public art projects at Cultural DC, including Construct, a series of art installations in vacant retail spaces, Sweet, a public art project with artist Nikisha Durrett, and Connect 4, a series of installations at Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial Library. Karyn has served on panels and lectured at a variety of institutions in the region and has curated and juried exhibitions at Civilian Art Projects, Orlando Museum of Art, Gettysburg College, School 33 Arts Center, Catholic University, and Maryland Institute College of Art. Hailing from rural Pennsylvania, Miller graduated with honors from the Catholic University of America with a Bachelor of Arts in Art History, and later received a Master of Arts in and Museum Studies from Georgetown University, during which she completed coursework at the Sotheby's Institute in New York. She has served as a lecturer at the Catholic University of America and as an adjunct professor at George Mason University. Okay, so let's just dive right in. This year, a global pandemic has left many museums, theaters, and cultural institutions shuttered and pushed much of public life outdoors, creating a great moment for people to experience public art. Simultaneously, protests and a racial reckoning sparked debate around public statues as Confederate monuments were toppled and burned, and public artworks, most notably murals, were used to amplify the Black Lives Matter movement. While these two forces are distinct and different, both serve to make 2020 a notable year for public art. This conversation will look at those two forces alongside specific project examples and moments of note, and how they have shaped the landscape of public art in 2020. So, Karyn, having laid all of this out there, I'd love to have you dive into these two forces that we are focused on tonight. Can you expand on them with some examples and what kinds of questions these forces have brought to the fore?
Sure. Do you mind pulling up the
Yeah.
PowerPoint, Megan? First, hi everyone. I'm so happy to be here tonight, wherever that wherever that nebulous space is that I'm occupying your computers, and hopefully we can have an interesting conversation about what's happening right now in the arts, and specifically with public art. I want to start by first saying it's been just an insane year. It's been incredibly difficult for so many people. It's been strange and weird. It's been a year marked by unimaginable tragedy for so many people, and just a massive amount of social and political upheaval. So I want to acknowledge and honor that. And I want to start with a slide of Suzanne Brennan Firstenberg's public art piece. And I think it's an especially poignant piece to look at this week when the US topped 250,000 COVID deaths. This piece is in Washington, D.C., and it's called "In America, How Could This Happen?" And it's an interactive piece where people can add flags to it. So it's a year that for me, I feel like has inspired a lot of personal reflection, but also has raised some questions about how all of this impacts the arts landscape, and especially public art. How do social and political forces shape public art, and has public art influenced social and political forces? To look at it sort of conversely. And this is something that interests me in general as a curator. In 2018, I curated a show at Arlington Arts Center called "If You and No One Else," and it examined the impact and the imprint that a Trump presidency would have on artistic production. And I just thought this year has been really interesting and fascinating in terms of public art, in terms of the output, dialogue, production, etc. So Megan, if you can go to the next slide. So I want to consider two different forces today. The first of which is that museums and artists and cultural institutions, I feel, are embracing public art in I think a new and interesting way. And many have vocalized new support for public art. So this is just a screenshot of the Hirshhorn's homepage: "Fresh art, free art, sculpture garden, plan your visit." So museums are saying, come to our sculpture gardens. You can go to the next slide as well, Megan. And then this is a think piece that was written by the director of the Nasher Sculpture Center that was basically this call to museums that may be closed or having restricted visitation, that there's this opportunity around public art to still engage audiences and visitors around sort of new types of programming or sort of reinvigorated outdoor programs as well. So that's the first force. And then the second force, of course, is the way that we've seen art sort of amplify a call for racial justice, and then at the same time see symbols of systemic racism, colonialism, and America's Confederate history fall. So museums, artists, and political leaders have looked to art as a way to talk about social and political issues at the fore, like racism and systemic police violence. If you want to keep going, Megan. And we've seen its impact around the world, not just in the US. This is a project that was done in Germany on a section of the Berlin Wall. So I want to move to a couple of additional ideas, you can advance, Megan. As we go through this, I'm going to show some examples of projects from 2020 that I have found particularly interesting. And Billy and Megan are going to talk about some things that they've worked on and projects that they have found interesting, sort of given these two forces and what's happened in 2020 as well. But I want to hold a couple of questions and ideas in our minds as we advance. So these two forces that I just outlined very quickly, I think beg some big questions, which are how are our public spaces shaped? Who shapes those spaces? Who has permission and authority to do that? Who gets to make the art? Who are the artists that are chosen and why? Who makes these decisions? Who is represented and how are they represented in public spaces? And I think it's an interesting question to hold on to, not just for tonight, but as we go out into our neighborhoods and communities and explore other neighborhoods and communities and look at how those public spaces are shaped.
Yeah, and I think the interesting thing about these questions is that they are more thought processes than real questions that have answers, for sure. But I think that a lot of the upheaval has brought them really to the forefront of a lot of artists' thought processes around making public art and around taking in public art. And certainly when you're thinking about, you know, why certain projects are backed and others are not. Like,
and full disclosure, I have like no intention of giving conclusive answers to any of these questions. You know, it's muddy and messy and a complicated sort of thing, but that's what's, I think, so interesting and so provocative about it, and why we have to keep asking these questions.
Billy, did you want to say something?
Yeah, no, I think it's definitely a work in progress, and public art is always about context, and the context has suddenly changed. So it's, for one, it's causing us to re-examine sculptures that have existed for a very, very long time. And then at the same time, I think it's opening channels for new forms of expression and new ways of kind of engaging in public space, because being outside is a different activity in and of itself at this point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I'm going to move to the next. So the other two things are that art has power and public spaces hold power. And I feel strongly about that. We've seen the full power of art deployed this year, whether it's through the creation of different murals like at Black Lives Matter Plaza, or through the removal and destruction of monuments. And we'll give some more examples of these in a little bit, just to provide a little bit more background and context. Much of this isn't new. Artists, curators, and arts organizations, they've been rethinking, re-envisioning, and creating innovative new projects, strategies, sculptures for decades. As one example, and activists and political leaders have been questioning and pushing this, but it's 2020 has heightened our awareness of it, and the importance of asking these questions. I believe in a new way and in a more acute way. So I think Megan and Billy are going to talk a little bit more about context and background, specifically how it applies to Baltimore and to the work that's been done at Loyola with one of Billy's classes, which is fascinating.
Great. So I was teaching a service learning course, which is a studio arts and communications upper level course called Public Art. And we had community partners lined up in Baltimore, in the Mid-Govans neighborhood. We had projects that we were ready to implement. One was a continuation from the last year, which was a memorial garden for a council member who had been shot. And we've been working on a mosaic garden in his honor. and then also some environmental projects in the parks. But when COVID hit, we had to completely rearrange our semester and figure out how to go forward. And so I sort of dreamed up this project that I thought would accomplish a few goals, because one of the core goals of the class is to have students like really analyze their position at Loyola, the communities that surround them, the context of Baltimore, racial justice. We do a lot of work with looking at redlining, systemic racism, and then how public art can interact within that highly contested field. So, in 2017, in the summer, after the events in Richmond, in which a protester was killed by a white nationalist, the mayor of Baltimore took down 4 Confederate monuments in the middle of the night. And so we have these empty plinths sitting all around Baltimore. And it's something that actually came up in one of our department meetings. And our colleagues we were all talking about how this presented this really interesting opportunity, just this kind of blank canvas that, and we had some ideas about maybe inviting, a national call of ideas. What could we do with these plinths? They've been sitting this way for, at this point now, 3 years. So in light of that, I just decided to kind of try to interject my class into this situation and see what we could do. So I challenged them to look at these 4 monuments or that used to exist there. Now they're just empty pedestals. And so one of them is the Roger B. Taney, which is the one on the right. And that was, he was a judge who authored the Dred Scott decision, which basically said that African Americans were not valued as citizens. It was commissioned by William T. Walters, and he actually created the original piece for the Maryland State House, and then it was replicated for this area in Baltimore. And if you don't know, the collection of William T. Walters formed the core of the Walters Museum. So there's, and then also the sculptor is, his last name is Reinhardt, and if you know Micah, the sculpture department is called the Reinhardt School of Sculpture. So you do have this legacy of the Confederacy kind of running through and touching on Baltimore institutions. And so I'll get to Veronica's idea there on the right a little bit more in depth in the next slides. On the left, we have the Confederate Soldiers and Sailors Memorial, which was doused in red paint. So you can advance the slide. And so I asked them to really look at the history and visit the places if they could. And we also looked at Trafalgar Square and a lot of the things that have been going on there with filling an empty plinth. If you don't know that project, look it up. It's pretty amazing what they've been doing there. And I was really proud of my students. I mean, we workshopped our ideas over Zoom, right as the pandemic was hitting, and it was pretty emotional. And some of the ideas, definitely needed work. But I think after many weeks of kind of working through the process, we ended up with some stellar ideas. So Courtney Kenny there on the left. If you're probably familiar with this, this is the Stonewall Jackson and Robert E. Lee in Wyman Park Dell across from the Baltimore Museum of Art. And there you see it says "Purpose So Great," which is the insignia that's left over on it. And I just thought, so she's really interested in the pencils and the these kind of stick figures raising up education and how that representing it as a community process and just riffing off of that idea of purpose so great. So I thought that was an interesting way to repurpose that. And Catherine took on the Roger B. Taney. Actually, I think all of the other examples are of the Roger B. Taney empty pedestal there. And so this idea of inequality and basically a broken justice system. And I thought this model was a really nice way of representing that. We talked a lot about how the shadows themselves would create this really striking image. And then Alden Coyne, she wanted to create a living sculpture. So you have the gavel in the middle and a tree growing around it, wrapping around it to sort of symbolize the just like repurposing of this monument in a way that would be a growth for good. So we can advance to the next slide. And then a few more here. These slides here I thought were an interesting little curated group because they all thought about ways that the pedestal could be repurposed in actually using it as a performative object. So on the left, Paige Adkins thought about the idea that the judge sits in this high chair and that it would be nice to create this kind of elaborate metalwork chair that viewers could climb up and sit in and take pictures in and pose in. Knowing how everyone loves to take Instagram photos, that was kind of her goal there, but also just sort of saying, in that action that might seem very superficial, it could also sort of say that, we all should have control over this justice. And Alex Heredia in the middle, she really wanted to, we did talk a lot about, like, what do you do with these spaces? You don't want to erase the history necessarily, right? You don't want to just put up something completely new, or do you? I mean, that was a debate. There's no clear direction, but she wanted to tell the story. So she devised the system of ladders and inscribed the story of the Dred Scott decision so that would not be erased. And obviously that would allow people to climb up onto the pedestal. And then Veronica had this lovely idea to repurpose the pedestal as a community garden, using the book as the sort of pot or container for the soil. And in some of her other renderings, she devised this whole system of community gardens that would surround the Roger B. Taney memorial. So you can jump to the next slide.
Yeah. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Baltimore artist Aydah Pinkston, who has done some work with these empty plinths and thinking about monuments. She has a project called Landmarked, which actually has its own independent website from her other artist website. Wherein it's a sort of elaborate three-phased project to reconsider monuments, and very much coming out of the sort of upheaval that happening around the Confederate monuments in Baltimore, which had been protested and defaced, and violence and against them had happened long before they were removed, and sort of long before now in this moment of protests, where we've seen a lot of Confederate monuments removed. And I just like what she said here, Landmarked is an exploration of the architectural objects that we call monuments, unearthing unheard stories about landmarks, monuments, and the spaces of the country that are publicly and privately declared sacred. And then she talks about how many Confederate monuments there are in the country, and how many of them have been removed, and seeking ways to sort of inject a different voice into the sort of emptiness of these spaces, which still, as we've been talking about, hold a lot of power. And the spaces themselves have this kind of memory to them. And, one of the things that we know, one of the ways that we know that monuments, and these spaces hold so much power is because of the violence that is done to them. And even just from looking at the empty plinths that continually have graffiti, continually have people sort of injecting their thoughts and feelings and their own sort of artistic presentation onto them. That's another way in which we can understand that. And you can kind of still see the remainders of some of that red paint that it was doused in. But I wanted to go back to this for a second, because what she did was a number of workshops where she asked these kinds of questions. And in addition to the ones that you see here, like, where are your monuments? Do monuments mean anything? What are your landmarks? What will monuments look like in the future? Some of the other questions were, how often do you look at monuments? And what spaces are sacred to you? And as you can see here, I really like the question, do monuments mean anything to you? And one of the things that she says is, this dialogue is essential in places where it is rejected because people think it is unnecessary. We exist in silos, and I seek to create bridges with or without a permit. And so this is her performance actions on these same plinths that we were just talking about with the projects that Billy's students were doing last semester. This is from 2018. So again, long before what we're talking about for these last 8 months. But Baltimore has this history with these monuments, and they are very visible, and the plinths themselves are continue to be very visible to the spaces. And one of the things that she said, that Aydah said, is I view these empty spaces as metaphors for the silences that exist in history. And so activating them in a way becomes a means to create connections to populations that have been silenced, to histories and moments that are erased when you create such a fixed monument to a fixed person or idea. And then I just wanted to bring in one other example of another Baltimore-based artist who had done work relating to these monuments. And again, you can see here that this work started before the monuments were removed. So this work is called Madre Luz, and it was created before the removal of the monuments in Wyman Park. This is the Wyman Park Dell, the plinth that's across the street from the BMA. The idea actually originated in 2015, and it was placed in front of the sculpture was placed in front of the Lee and Jackson Monument in 2015. And within 24 hours, it was impounded by authorities. And the artist, Pablo Macchioli, was fined. So the sculpture was removed, and then the protests from Charlottesville happened. And those sent shockwaves through many American cities, and including and especially Baltimore. And Macchioli decided at that point to return the statue to the front of the Lee and Jackson monument. And it was promptly, after returning it there, it was promptly knocked over and damaged, and then repaired and replaced there. And then once the monument was removed, you can see here, it was placed in its stead. And then once again, knocked over. So again, this sort of violence and the cycle of aggravation that these monuments cause, and that the removal of monuments cause, and that the change in these spaces cause, hold a lot of power. And so this is one example of that sort of journey that we've taken with some of these plinths. And the truth is that anything that replaces these monuments, anything that is on these plinths, is really, it will always carry that legacy and that history with them. And even if the plinths aren't there, that space that holds that memory. And I think that's something that's really important to think about as we talk about public space and public art within it, especially during this time. And so I think, Karyn, you had prepared a survey of some highlighted artists and projects and organizations that demonstrate some of these current responses to these two forces we're talking about here. And I think we can keep in mind all of these things that we've already talked about Baltimore and the context and history that we're sort of living in while we go through that. But I wanted to give you the opportunity to walk us through some of those.
Sure. So there are so many projects that aren't captured here. I just want to put out that caveat first, and that I think in a way a rapid fire, which is what I'm going to do here, I think is an injustice to how interesting and important many of these artworks and projects and moments and ideas are.
Yeah.
So I
The
encourage.
story continues though. So
Yes.
go look things up.
Yes,
after
that's what I was going to say. I encourage you to take a deeper dive than what I'm going to take right now. But what I wanted to do was to sort of point to the volume of work and activity that's being done around these ideas and these problems and questions, so that we can consider that. So I'm going to move pretty quickly through that, and I know we all want to talk more with each other and hear what questions you have too. So so the first is I want to talk about our first track, which is how artists have and cultural institutions have responded to the pandemic. So the first example, it's taken from a New York Times article about a drive-by art show. So the shape of art and the platforms for art have changed with the pandemic. Where can you put art safely? Art has been pushed outdoors in all kinds of interesting ways. And we've seen how brilliantly artists, galleries, and arts organizations can adapt and innovate to these challenges. So this was a drive-by art exhibition that was held in Long Island over the summer. The next slide shows that it's not just a change in the shape of art, but we have also seen a shift in subject, themes, and content matter. Art is responsive to the present moment and has played a significant role in communicating public health messages around the world, which you can see in these images of street art from Norway to Austin. And then many museums that were or are still closed have shifted their programming to utilize their outdoor spaces, including the Queen's Museum in New York, which was what we see here. So while they were closed and their parking lot was empty, artist Jorge Rodriguez Herrera transformed the empty parking lot of the Queen's Museum into a mammoth mural dedicated to healthcare workers. Times Square Arts also helmed a citywide public art initiative called Messages to the City. It took over the billboards that you usually see for advertisements in Times Square, but also was extended beyond Times Square into the rest of New York City as well. And then to bring it back to Baltimore again, the pandemic has also spurred exciting design and creative placemaking projects, like this one in Baltimore called Design for Distancing, that was led by the Neighborhood Design Center and the Baltimore Development Corporation. It's designed to engage artists and designers to help address both public health needs and support business recovery during the pandemic throughout Baltimore. And then we've also seen museums and cultural institutions sort of encourage us to reframe existing public art projects. And we've seen the media support it as well through press. I've come across countless articles about, explore public art in your own neighborhood or come downtown and explore public art. And these are just a few examples of that sort of thing. Miss Museums, go outside has I think been a pretty dominant message this year. And then the next project Billy had suggested, so I don't know if you want to talk about it a little bit more.
Sure. Yeah. So Hank Willis Thomas and Baz Dreisinger had done a similar project on the High Line in New York as more of an installation space. And Baz has been working with incarcerated individuals, collecting their writing for many years. And when the pandemic hit, they came up with this idea to actually just project these writings directly onto the criminal justice buildings in Manhattan. And I just think it's an interesting move, because one of the things that Hank Willis Thomas talked about is that they basically distilled what was this installation art piece down to its essence and that the impact of the text itself in this bright sans serif all caps font, just on the context of the justice buildings was enough. And that was something that could function outside of the artwork, that it even just functioned without being seen in person. Just immediately you see the context of the building and the text together. But it's also like a beacon. It's and so what they're doing here is talking about, obviously the coronavirus has hit the prison industrial complex very hard, and so in a sense, like he's bringing up the topic that basically to be detained in the system at this point is pretty close to being given the life sentence, because the dangers of coronavirus in that environment are so high. And so, projection has been used a lot, over the years. This is not like a new technique necessarily. Krzysztof Wodyczko has done some amazing work in this area. And, I think a lot of artists are starting to do this. There was some great projects in Philadelphia recently doing projection of text on city buildings. I know in DC, there's a lot of artists projecting on the Trump Hotel, all sorts of messages. But I just think, this piece really speaks volumes. And I think what works really well about it is it takes a community that you are not able to hear from, and it broadcasts their voice in a way that is accessible in public space.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to toggle to our second force that I talked about in the beginning, and we've talked about it throughout. But the impact that the protests, that this rethinking of monuments and public space have had on the public art landscape as well. So the first images are of Black Lives Matter Plaza. It's a space. Do you mind going to the next slide, Megan? It's a space that I've visited and been in a lot because I work right by it. The image on the top left is from Washington, D.C. And it was done following the protests around the killing of George Floyd. And it spurred all of these other murals around the country. So you see Seattle, New York, Charlotte, Tulsa, Brooklyn. The list goes on and on. This is just a handful that we've seen. We've also seen a profusion of murals related to racial justice and police violence across America as well. So we see a mural in the top left by an artist named Matt Hunter of Breonna Taylor riding on horseback, monumentalized. A piece by Nick C. Kirk reading "Demilitarize the Police," going clockwise. Amir Diop, a mural in Soho, New York. And finally, a piece that was done in Washington, D.C. through the Paints Institute at the National Building Museum. So in addition to artwork being made, we've seen sculptures and monuments removed, as Billy and Megan have already talked about. And I want to talk a little bit more. I think Megan touched on this really well earlier, but I want to talk a little bit more about it. I find it so interesting to think about the power that these spaces and that these images hold. And I want to talk a little bit about the idea of iconoclasm, which just very literally means image breaking. And I was reading this article about iconoclasm in ancient Egypt that I thought was super interesting, and it talked about and I'm just gonna quote from it about how damaging an object suspends it between existence and non-existence. It exists but not wholly. The object is disconnected from its full power and is instead reduced or appropriated for the benefit of the destroyer. It's a way of interrogating the history of an object to uncover why it was damaged, by whom, and particular ways in which it was damaged. So you can see the power is changed, it's transmuted. It's just something that I find endlessly fascinating as we have this conversation about monuments. You can go to the next slide. So there's been so much interesting work done around this, and we have seen that there's a gap in representation across the country with public monuments. So in Central Park this year unveiled were the first sculptures of women that were not fictional. Prior to that, we had Alice in Wonderland and Mother Goose, but no real women depicted in Central Park. But even that has been fraught with debate. Originally, it was two white suffragettes who were depicted. Later, Sojourner Truth was added to the design of it, and then there was much debate about how she was depicted. So I mean, these conversations are important. We should be asking who is being represented, back to those big questions, and why and how they're being represented. You can go to the next slide, and just another clip from New York Times. This sort of race to build monuments that's happening now, to try and correct this, but it's something that needs to be done, in my opinion. It needs to be done very thoughtfully, and it needs to be done with the right people. And I like this quote from here, about how arguments have broken out over who should be honored, who should create the statues, what they should look like, and where they should be located. And then finally, there's been so much interesting work done around this, whether from a journalistic standpoint. This is an article that was in City Lab by Kristen Capps about a month ago, about how there must be a better way to make a monument, and the way that artists and activists are approaching this around the country. And then some organizations and funders doing really important work around this as well. So the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation announced a $250 million grant commitment for their monuments project to reimagine and rebuild commemorative spaces and transform the way that history is told in the United States. One of their grant recipients was a nonprofit called Monument Lab, which I could fangirl about for days and days. I think they've been doing such interesting work, both from a sort of theoretical thought leadership standpoint, but then also just like putting amazing art projects into public space. They were awarded a $4 million grant from the Mellon Foundation. And I think they're going to do some really interesting work with that. They're also doing an audit of monuments across the US, just to really understand what we have and what's in public spaces. So you can
advance.
Yeah.
I think that the monument lab, I totally agree.
we can fangirl Monument Lab together
forever. But I think that the Monument Lab National Audit is a great transition point back to our big questions from the beginning, and hopefully a step towards answering them, at least sort of in reverse, right? Like if we understand and move towards if we understand what it is that we have and why, and like where all of these things are, then we have a much greater sort of network of understanding how to move forward potentially in a different towards a different answer in the future, as to like what a monument is. And I think it's really Aydah Pinkston, who I brought in before, is actually a 2020 Monument Lab fellow, which is really great because I think she's been asking these same questions forever, and her landmark project that I had brought up is really essentially a multi-phased way of asking the question, what does a monument for everyone look like? Or does it exist? Like, is it a thing that we can actually hold, and hold space for? So
Yep.
we can
So the next slide shows a final project that I just wanted to sort of hold here for a moment as we're drawing some conclusions and talk about a few other things. But it's the Robert E. Lee Memorial in Richmond that has become this site for Black dance, and I think, you know, it I think starts to answer some questions about how artists and communities can intervene in spaces and reclaim spaces and add meaning to spaces, and help us rethink public space in all kinds of, I think, really amazing and powerful ways.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think, and it's incredible too to just think about how it's 2020, right? And we only just recently brought down some of these monuments in Richmond. And I remember being in Richmond probably 4 years ago, and it's such an incredible city. Like you can find an incredible artistic, like there's a ton of artists there, and just thoughtful spaces and interesting restaurants and interesting music scene. And then, you know, you go around the city and you go down this Monument Row, and it's almost like it's a palpable difference between the character almost of the rest of the city. And then at the time when I was there, there were folks carrying Confederate flag outside of the gallery, the museum in Richmond.
Mm-hmm.
And it was just such a stark
Right.
shift in character generally.
And were you there prior to when they'd installed Candy Wiley's rebuttal?
I think I must have been. I think
Yeah.
I knew that it was coming, but I don't think
Yeah.
it was.
So I didn't include this work, but if you all aren't familiar, the artist Candy Wiley was commissioned by the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts to do a piece, and it's a contemporary monument and a re-envisioning and rebuttal to Confederate Row, and it's called Rumors of War, I believe is the title of it. And it shows a Black man on horseback, monumentalized. But I think pulling back a little bit from the monument conversation, because I mean, a conversation about monument is like, you know, it's 10, you could have 100 panel discussions about it. It's so fascinating. It's so complicated. There's so many different ways you can go about it. When we were preparing for this, I was like, I really kind of want to talk about like what they've done in communist countries with monuments, right, and how they've dealt with that legacy in other places. And I'm like, that's a whole other panel discussion. Right. But I do think it you know, it's just to sort of back out of that a little bit to the whole conversation. I think, like, you know, one of the things that I think that this year has taught me at least more about is thinking about our own communities and our own spaces, and also just that, you know, there are other museums are great. I miss them so much. I just heard today that the Smithsonian is going to be closing again as of September, or I don't even know what month it is. November 23rd. As of November 23rd, with no date set to reopen. And I know some of us really desperately miss museums and theaters and dance and cultural institutions. And, you know, I look to all the sort of like all the innovation that has been done this year to put to give people programming, to feed people the culture that we need, and in a time that is so difficult and so dark in so many ways, to still have access to culture, I think is so important.
For sure.
But I don't know if we want to roll into, I know we each had prepared sort of how we've been thinking about and approaching our work during this time, because I think it relates nicely to our conversation as a whole.
Yeah, absolutely. Before we do that, though, I do want to put in another plug for people to ask questions, as we get towards the end of the program, and then also to engage in this conversation we're about to have, because Karyn and Billy and I are about to show you some things that some art that we've engaged with in this time that sort of has been made possible by these forces that have happened in our country and around the world. But we want to know what you've engaged with in terms of art, and especially with public art. So if you want to you can put that in the Q&A, or in the Q&A, put that in the Q&A, even if it's not a question, that's fine. And we'll read some of those out as well. So yeah, we would love for you to engage in this discussion too, and let us know your questions. So I'm gonna go back to, I just wanted to, since we were just talking about it, this is the sculpture that the VMFA commissioned from Kehinde Wiley. And then let's see, let's go back to the PowerPoint. All right, so I'm up first. So when we sort of had this conversation about how we could present some art that we've engaged with, originally we were talking about, okay, so what public art have you engaged with? And I wanted to sort of shift that conversation a little bit and talk about how incredible this time has been in terms of access to art everywhere. And I know that we are all missing cultural institutions, and believe me, as the gallery, as a director of a gallery, we miss you too. Like, we miss having those spaces filled with people taking in art. But one interesting thing is the internet provides a kind of public space that we can all engage in, and we've seen so many different ways to engage, and so many institutions trying to find ways to keep connections with their audiences, and to give artists opportunities. Artists are really hurting right now. The gig economy in general is very a hard place to be in right now. So I wanted to feature a couple of internet space objects or programs and things that you can engage in, and that I've been engaged in a lot. So Be More Art, if you are not aware of, is an excellent, amazing resource that is focused on Baltimore particularly. And every week they come out with their picks. And I think right now these are all happening in virtual space. So a lot of interesting things to connect to just right here at home in Baltimore. And then I think that the Smithsonian's have been doing a good job with this, but especially the Hirshhorn Museum has done an excellent job connecting us with artists. There's been a ton of artist talks at various different times of day, noon, 7, 4, 2, all of these different times of day that you can connect with really incredible artists, even just on this slide. And this is just a snapshot from a 2 or 3 week period. Laurie Anderson, Oliver Eliason, there's incredible artists that you can connect to. And I think all of these were recorded, so they're all available to watch now. And actually Monument Lab was one of the earlier artist collectives that was featured on the Hirshhorn at Home series. And then like further afield, I mean, you don't even have to stay in your own backyard. There's online tours of the Louvre. Like you can go into European spaces or all around the world. And most galleries and especially smaller spaces are having really, really great programming to connect to. And then finally, I wanted to just, this was just so amusing to me that very early in the pandemic, you can see the date here is March 25th, that the Getty Museum challenged, and it wasn't a new challenge, it's been done before, but challenged people to recreate works of art with objects and people in your home. And I just think that some of these are really amazing examples of people really engaging with art, and like this is some really close looking that is happening in our homes with artistic projects, and so I just really like those projects. So that's my piece.
Great, thank you. Actually, could you click back to the Hirshhorn real quick? So so I'm about to tell you about a show that I'm currently exhibiting in, and if you look in the bottom right corner, the curator is Sarah Tanguy, who was interviewed and basically does a walkthrough of the entire exhibition. So if you're interested, you can check out the Hirshhorn website. I've been enjoying, you can go back. I've been enjoying going to lots of talks. It's so much easier. You can do it while you're cooking dinner. Shout out to anybody who's laying down right now under a blanket, or shout out to drinking beverages, or just doing whatever you need to do. Maybe you're vacuuming while you're listening to this, but we can all do more things. We can multitask. So I'm just going to talk briefly about a work that came out. This show has been in the works for 3 years before this, but the context of the pandemic completely shifted everything about it. So there's a long-winded explanation, but I'll try to be brief. This piece was.
Do you want me to hit go while you're talking?
Yeah, in a second. Let me
Okay,
just
good.
yeah, thank you. It's a kinetic sculpture, and it's using solar panels to power the kinetic action, which there's 2 sounds that happen. And what you see, basically, there's bass strings strung within this tube, and they're being held in tension by an oil drum and a battery. And when I was creating it, I was really thinking a lot about the terrible things that are going on with the environment. The title is Nero Plays a Fiddle, which is a reference to the Roman emperor who played the fiddle while Rome burned. I guess you can hit play now. But so basically, I had this sculpture and several others planned for the exhibition. And then I quickly realized with the pandemic, there was just no way that amount of fabrication could take place. I did a site visit in the spring, and I was planning on going a completely different direction away from this piece, but the director of the museum thought this piece spoke to the current moment. And so I'm grateful that she kind of expressed that, because that brought me back to exploring this idea. Because the Nero Plays a Fiddle metaphor only got worse throughout the summer and continues. I'll be quiet for a second so you can hear the kind of drone sound that's going on. So that sound is activated by the viewer when they're in front of the bell. The other sound is activated whenever the sun strikes one of the solar panels. And so in terms of public art, I knew I wanted to exhibit in their sculpture garden because it's just really beautiful, and there's some amazing works. But it took on a completely different tone once the pandemic hit, because it opened before the museum opened. So people could come, and as soon as they opened the sculpture garden, they just had massive amounts of visitors, because everybody was looking to get out of the house and also see art, I guess. And so fabrication also changed in the process of the pandemic, because I only had so many materials. It actually helped me, because I tend to just continue doing too much, and it actually just led me to the like, okay, I have to stop. I only have these things. I have to make something with what I have right now. So in the end, it continues to, be open and active right now through January 15th. You can go to the museum, but there are only time tickets. But as Karyn mentioned earlier, it looks like DC may be shutting down. So it'll be interesting to see if the sculpture garden remains open to the public. Oh, and I should mention that Rania is also in the exhibition here. So it's a nice crossover.
So I think Megan asked me to do this talk in September, and I was like, okay, but maybe in November, because I'm just like too busy installing public art right now. She was like, well, what do you want to talk about? And I was like, I don't know. Like, I'll figure it out when I'm less busy. But then I started thinking about everything that I was working on. And I'll show you a couple of projects that I've worked on this year. And one relates to the conversation around monuments, and a couple of the projects have been done as a result of the pandemic for different reasons. So these are projects that I've done as the curator at the Golden Triangle Business Improvement District, which is in DC's Central Business District. So basically, if you're familiar with DC, it's the area around the White House. So we worked with the Smithsonian on their American Women's History Initiative to install 2 public artworks on Connecticut Avenue. This is the first piece. It's called Marker, and it's by Rania Hassan. It was installed a little less than a month ago. And the artist is a textile-based artist. A lot of her work is knitted. This is her first ever public art piece, and she sees it as a way to enlarge her knit works and to make monumental the work of women that is often hidden from view. The other project that we did just north of this is a piece by Maren Hassinger, who is a Harlem-based artist, but also with a strong connection to Baltimore. She was at MICA for years. And this is a piece that is called Monument. Both pieces, in a sense, are monuments, and they don't represent any one person or individual. They're both abstract. This is a piece that the artist sees as a monument to nature, but also to what can be accomplished when we work together. It was built over the course of 2 days with different teams of volunteers, and sits along Connecticut Avenue just south of DuPont Circle. The next image is of a project that we did. It's COVID responsive. So this is a very busy area of Washington, D.C. The image where you see that, during normal times, on an average Tuesday, there's 22,000 people who walk by here, and it's a very narrow sidewalk. So we've been working with the city's Department of Transportation to widen sidewalks to allow for more social distancing. As a result, we got these rather ugly concrete barriers to extend the sidewalk into the street. So basically took a lane of parking and made it pedestrian space. And we worked with a muralist, Shama Couvert, who designed these murals to go onto these barriers to beautify them along the park. And then the final project that I'll show you is a project called Windows. So unfortunately, as a result of the pandemic, we've seen a lot of restaurants and retailers closed. Because of the protests, we saw spaces boarded up, and they were boarded up again around the election. But we did a call for artists and received, I think it was over 150 submissions. It was overwhelming. And worked with a panel to select 9 artists and install their work in windows around the neighborhood to brighten the community, during what is a difficult time for a lot of people. So just wanted to share those few projects.
So we have a really good question.
I know. I saw that there. I was like, we got to get to the end so we can talk about this question.
Here, I can read it for you guys, and then we can all sort of respond. in July, Donald Trump issued an executive order on monuments, which stipulated that federal agencies should prioritize commissioning only figurative statues of historical figures, specifically prohibiting new abstract or modernist representations. At the same time, many of the new public artworks in our presentation were also figurative or lifelike representations. What does this say about our public art and culture at large? And what role do you see abstraction playing in monuments and public art in the future? And I just want to say that this question came from Jackson Gilman Forlini, who was one of our panelists in our previous public art panel. So I really appreciate it. Hi. I really appreciate you being here and continuing the conversation with us.
So when I was designing the piece for the Krieger Museum, my first thought was I wanted to put a turbine up because I know that Donald Trump hates turbines, and it would be sort of close to his house. But it's so interesting because I was sort of thinking about this as the presentation was going on, that as we try to, as the arguments happen over who should be represented, is the problem that the format is that we are identifying individuals rather than communities, or specific people rather than a more, and that's something that I think abstraction can accomplish, is a more inclusive dialogue.
It was one of the reasons why I was so excited to do the collaboration with the Smithsonian on their American Women's History Initiative, because we got to create these monuments that in a sense were monuments to women and monuments to women and makers, and monuments that sort of magnified and amplified work and people that are often hidden or not seen in public spaces, and we weren't elevating a single individual. But it's not necessarily a comment on the executive order, but I think it's an expression of excitement around other possibilities, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense. And one thing a lot of the work that we showed in response to the pandemic is mural based, and a lot of that is figurative, in just, I think, from a history of figurative work in that medium. And I think it's also there's an immediacy to it, I think, and it speaks very much to our specific time that we're in. But I've been thinking a lot, we talked a lot in our February discussion about public art about time-based and temporary work. And one of the things that I took away from Monument Lab's discussion, the at-home program with the Hirshhorn, was this. One of the things they said was, it feels hard to let go of the idea of permanence, but let's just try it as a thought process. And I think that was such a poignant thing to say. Like, it does feel hard to let go, but these are things that, particularly these pandemic responses, are so specific to this time period. And I think it's okay to think through having them and then letting them go.
Right. I mean, when we think of monuments, we think of them as these monolithic, static, unchanging things, and our public spaces in the same way. But I know for me, public space is so much more interesting when it's dynamic, when things are temporary, when there's this sense of surprise and a sense of change.
Well, and I think that your the widening of the sidewalk example is a really good way of showing that too, because it adapts, the space adapts to what is needed and what is necessary, and then taking that adaptation and creating art with it is it feels very natural in a way.
So, but to get back to the abstraction, I'm curious what you all think about that, because I mean, one of the issues is that, as we know, public art is often invisible to the public. And I don't know, Karyn, in your role, have you found the public to be more or less receptive to abstract works versus figurative works. I mean, I think when things are in place for a long period of time, no matter what they are, they get ignored. But I'm
I mean,
just
in in a way, in my experience, sometimes abstraction is easier to deal with from a like a approvals and consensus building standpoint.
Sure.
Just to be like, totally practical about it, because I'm not having to make a case for why we're representing this like one person on something.
Sure.
But again, like, just to clarify, I'm very interested in monuments. It's not the space that I live in or work in, at least from a traditional standpoint.
Yeah.
I think that, like what you were saying, to a certain extent, it doesn't matter, abstract, figural, it loses visibility over time, no matter what. And I think some of the examples that that were put forth in these articles that Karyn brought up, about 6 really famous artists that you probably walk by the public artwork every day. I mean, those are mostly abstract examples, and a lot of the earlier public art, I mean, outside of sort of the man on a horse example, it is abstract, and I don't think that has held this as the same kind of power over time in the same way that figurative sculptures have, monuments have. I would say there are certain examples that I do feel like Maya Lin's, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, I think is an example of an abstract work that continues to hold an incredible amount of power. And part of that, I think, is really because there is an interaction that continues to happen with the public and that work, with people leaving things and tracing the names, and just sort of running your fingers down the list and trying to find a person. I think the interaction with that work has given it more staying power. So I don't know, maybe that's the key, is it's less that abstraction is essential, but more interaction, and actually like an interaction with the community that the work is in, the space is that the work is in that space. So
I'm tempted to suggest that maybe what we need is just a revolving curatorial space on these plinths, or, but then from a practical standpoint, Karyn, was that even like a reality that could, because there's a lot of,
how quickly do you want it, Billy?
well, I brought up Trafalgar Square, and like, I know that they're like flush and they're attracting the highest,
yeah, no, I think that's a super interesting idea.
But I just, does that make you cringe to think like, oh?
No, I
guess your works are temporary.
I love temporary work. Most of the work that I do is temporary, but temporary for us is even like, it generally means a year or two, just because even with temporary projects, the planning timeline is usually at least 12 to 18 months. Mm-hmm. And we can do some stuff quicker depending on, we do space that's it's all public space, but some of it's federally owned, some of it's city owned, and requires different approvals that I won't get into. It's possible, and I think once you establish a program that this is what the program is, that it's a rotating space, it's a permanent space for temporary art.
Because I think that when you do limit the run of the public art, it opens not only that temporal space of like, this is only going to be there so long, and I interact with it when I walk down the street, but it also opens the door to other materials, because I think one of the issues is like bronze is just like
Yeah.
the thing because it's gonna last and it's proven, right?
Right.
But like Marin's piece with the wood, right? Obviously
Yeah.
that would not last, but
Yeah.
that's like kind of beautiful in a urban environment, in a sense of contrast, and to watch it decay over time.
Yeah, I was gonna bring that up too. I think that that's a lovely. I just love that use of material in that project. Yeah, and especially thinking about it as like a monument to everyone, sort of, you know, that everyone changes and the work is going to change over time, and that's really nice.
Changes every time I go by, for better or worse.
I don't see any more questions in our Q&A, so I think we can wrap up, and thank you all for coming and for sticking with us through the end. And I hope that you all will get out into public space, whether it be the internet public space or or actual physical public space, and see some artwork and interact in ways that are safe and healthy. And I wish you all happy holidays, and check back with us for more programming coming up in the future. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.